He thought humiliating her would be easy, but he had no idea he was about to lose control of the room he ruled. The afternoon light spilled across the polished wooden floors of ironclad dojo, where discipline echoed in every measured breath and every precise movement. And at the center of it all stood Brad Hoffman, a head instructor who had built his reputation on dominance, control, and the quiet fear of those who trained under him. So when the door opened and Amanda Carter stepped inside wearing a plain gray hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days, the shift in energy was immediate, subtle, but undeniable, because in a place where rank was everything, she looked like she didn't belong, and Brad noticed instantly, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with a smirk that had humiliated more than a few newcomers before. "This isn't a fitness class," he said, his voice carrying across the room as several black belts turned to look, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet amusement. Amanda didn't answer. She simply stood there, calm, almost too calm, as if the weight of their attention meant nothing, which only made the room more uncomfortable, because people like her were supposed to shrink, to hesitate, to apologize for being out of place, but she didn't, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. "You lost," another instructor added, drawing a few chuckles from the students lining the mat, the sound bouncing lightly off the walls, filling the silence that followed like a low hum of judgment. Amanda's gaze moved slowly across the room, not defensive, not intimidated, just observant, as if she were measuring something no one else could see. And for a brief second, one of the younger students hesitated, noticing the way she stood, balanced, grounded, like someone who understood the space in a way beginners never did. But the moment passed as Brad stepped closer, tightening the invisible circle around her. "We train seriously here," he continued, his tone sharpening just enough to remind everyone who was in charge. "So, unless you're ready for that, you might want to try somewhere else." A few nods followed. The unspoken agreement of a group used to hierarchy, used to knowing exactly where they stood and exactly where she didn't. Amanda adjusted the sleeve of her hoodie, a small, almost insignificant movement, but something about it felt deliberate, controlled, and in that moment, the air shifted again, so slightly that most didn't notice, but those who were paying attention felt it, like the calm before something they couldn't quite name. Brad exhaled through his nose, unimpressed, misreading her silence as uncertainty, as weakness, the same mistake he had made 100 times before with people who walked in thinking they were ready for something they didn't understand. "Tell you what," he said, turning slightly so the entire room could hear, "why don't we see what you've got?" The words hung there, casual on the surface but edged with challenge, with expectation, with the quiet promise of embarrassment. A test not designed to evaluate, but to expose, and a few students shifted closer, sensing something worth watching, the kind of moment that broke the monotony of routine. Amanda looked at him then, really looked, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match the situation. And for the first time, just for a fraction of a second, Brad hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to register somewhere deep beneath his confidence, something unfamiliar, something he quickly dismissed as irrelevant, because in his world, control was never questioned. "Go ahead," he added, stepping back slightly, opening the space like a stage, the room falling quieter now, anticipation replacing amusement. Amanda stepped forward, slow, measured, her movements almost effortless, and in that instant, without a single word, without any display of force or urgency, something changed completely, the kind of change you don't see but feel, the kind that makes people hold their breath without knowing why. And as she settled into position, the faintest shift in her posture spoke louder than anything she could have said, because it wasn't the stance of someone guessing, or trying, or hoping. It was the stance of someone who already knew exactly how this would end. The room held its breath, not because anything had happened yet, but because something felt different in a way no one could explain, and Amanda Carter stood there without rushing, without proving, without even acknowledging the tension that had quietly wrapped itself around every person watching, while Brad Hoffman folded his arms, confident in the outcome he had already written in his mind. "Go on," he said, his voice carrying just enough impatience to remind everyone that this was supposed to be quick, supposed to be simple, supposed to end the way it always did. with someone realizing they had overestimated themselves. But Amanda did not move immediately. She simply adjusted her footing again, her weight settling evenly, as if she were aligning with something internal rather than external. And one of the senior students near the edge of the mat narrowed his eyes slightly, noticing the precision of that movement. The kind of precision that did not come from guessing, but from repetition, from years of understanding something deeper than what was being shown. "You are wasting time," Brad added, a faint edge of irritation slipping into his tone now as the silence stretched longer than he liked, because control depended on momentum, and she was disrupting it without saying a word. Amanda finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully for the first time, and there was no challenge in it, no arrogance, just a calm certainty that did not match the situation, which made it far more unsettling than any obvious defiance could have been. "Whenever you are ready," she said softly, her voice steady, almost quiet enough that the room had to lean into it. And that was when something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. As if the balance of the room had tilted in a direction no one had expected, Brad stepped forward, his movements practiced and controlled. The confidence of someone who had repeated the same demonstration countless times, expecting the same result, expecting the same reaction, expecting the same outcome. But what he did not expect was the absence of hesitation in Amanda's posture, the absence of uncertainty in her breathing, the absence of everything he relied on to read a person. And for a brief second, that absence created a gap, a moment where instinct and expectation no longer aligned. And in that gap, something changed. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was not even obvious to those who were not paying attention. But to the few who were, it was unmistakable. The way she shifted her stance by inches, the way her shoulders relaxed instead of tensed, the way her focus narrowed without hardening. It was the kind of control that did not need to announce itself, because it had nothing to prove. And suddenly the room no longer felt like a place where someone was about to be embarrassed. It felt like a place where something was about to be revealed, and Brad felt it too, though he could not name it, could not admit it. So he did what he had always done. He continued forward, expecting the moment to resolve in his favor, expecting her to react the way everyone else did. But she did not react. She responded, and that difference was everything, because in less than a second, the rhythm he relied on was gone, replaced by something he did not control, something precise, something final in a way that required no repetition. And though there was no dramatic sound, no exaggerated motion, the shift in the room was immediate, undeniable, like a current had passed through everyone at once. And when it ended, when the movement settled and stillness returned, no one laughed, no one spoke, no one even moved, because what they had just witnessed did not match what they believed was possible. And Brad remained where he was, not defeated in the way they expected, but paused, suspended in the realization that the certainty he had carried into that moment no longer existed. And across from him, Amanda stood exactly as she had before, calm, composed, unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, which somehow made it even more impossible to ignore. And in that silence, heavy and absolute, the hierarchy of the room shifted without a single word being spoken. No one spoke because no one knew how to explain what had just happened, and in a place built on certainty, that silence felt heavier than any confrontation ever could, as the students along the edge of the mat exchanged glances that carried more questions than words, while Brad Hoffman remained still, not out of weakness, but out of something far more unfamiliar to him, hesitation. The kind that only appears when reality refuses to match expectation. And Amanda Carter did not move to claim the moment. She did not look around for validation. She simply stood there as if the outcome had never been in doubt, as if this was not a performance, but a correction. And that was what unsettled the room the most. Because people understood competition, they understood struggle, but they did not understand quiet certainty, especially not from someone they had already dismissed. One of the younger students finally shifted his weight, the soft sound of his foot against the mat breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone they were still there, still watching, still trying to process what they had witnessed. "How did she?" someone whispered. The question trailing off because no one wanted to finish it. No one wanted to admit that they had misread her completely. Brad inhaled slowly, regaining composure piece by piece, his posture straightening as he stepped back, creating distance not just physically but mentally, as if he needed space to rebuild the structure that had just been quietly dismantled. That was, he began, then stopped, the words refusing to come together in a way that maintained his authority, because any explanation that diminished what had happened would sound hollow, and any acknowledgement of it would shift the balance of the room even further. Amanda glanced at him briefly, not with defiance, not with superiority, but with a kind of calm recognition, as if she understood exactly what he was experiencing and chose not to press it, which only deepened the discomfort, because it removed the option of turning this into a confrontation, turning it into something familiar. Instead, it forced everyone to sit with what they had seen, and that required a different kind of strength, one that could not be measured by rank or title. One of the senior students cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly, his tone more cautious now. "Where did you train?" he asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. And for the first time since she had entered the room, Amanda paused before answering, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Different places," she said simply, her voice steady, offering just enough truth to be honest while leaving the rest untouched. And that answer lingered in the air, incomplete but somehow sufficient, because it confirmed what they were beginning to understand, that her experience did not fit neatly into the structure they relied on, that it existed outside of their expectations. Brad watched her carefully now, no longer seeing a misplaced beginner, but something far more complex, something that required him to reconsider not just her, but himself, the way he judged, the way he led, the way he defined strength. And that realization did not come easily. It never did, but it had already begun, whether he wanted it to or not. Amanda adjusted her sleeve again, the same small, deliberate motion from before, and stepped back slightly, returning the space to what it had been, not claiming it, not owning it, just releasing it. And that was when the room shifted one final time, because respect, real respect, does not arrive with noise or demand. It settles quietly, unmistakably, and every person standing there felt it, even if they could not yet put it into words. And as the silence slowly dissolved into quiet movement, into controlled breaths and measured glances, one truth remained clear in a way that could not be undone. They had not just witnessed a demonstration, they had witnessed a revelation, and nothing in that room would feel quite the same again. Brad Hoffman had spent years building authority in that room, but in a matter of seconds, something invisible had slipped through his grasp, and now every movement he made carried the quiet weight of being watched differently, not with automatic respect, but with evaluation, and that was something he had not felt in a long time. He cleared his throat, the sound cutting gently through the lingering silence as he straightened his posture. "All right," he said, forcing a controlled tone, attempting to pull the room back into structure, back into something familiar. But the usual rhythm did not return, because everyone had already seen what could not be unseen, and Amanda Carter stood near the edge of the mat now, no longer at the center, her presence quieter than before, yet somehow more defined, as if stepping back had only made her more visible in a way that demanded no attention but received it anyway. One of the senior students, Marcus, shifted closer, his earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to respect. "You have trained for a long time," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement, and Amanda gave a small nod, not expanding, not explaining, just confirming enough to let the truth settle where it needed to. And that simplicity carried more weight than any detailed answer could have, because it left no room for doubt. Brad watched the exchange carefully, the shift in tone, the shift in posture, the shift in the room itself. And he understood what was happening even if he did not want to accept it fully. Authority was no longer something he could assume. It was something he would now have to hold, carefully, intentionally. "What matters here is discipline," he said, stepping forward again, reclaiming a portion of the space, though his voice carried less edge than before, more measured, more aware. "Anyone can have experience, but this is about how we train together." And though the words were familiar, their delivery was not. Because for the first time, they were not aimed at putting someone in their place. They were an attempt to stabilize a structure that had been quietly challenged. Amanda listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in her posture, as if she recognized the effort behind his words, the adjustment, the attempt to recalibrate without losing face, and she allowed it, not by agreeing or disagreeing, but by simply not opposing it. And that choice, that restraint, spoke louder than any correction could have, because it gave him space to recover while making it clear that she did not need to prove anything further. A few students began to move again, returning to their positions, but their attention remained divided, half on their practice, half on her, as if they were trying to reconcile the image they had formed with the reality now standing in front of them. Marcus glanced toward Brad, then back to Amanda. "Would you train with us?" he asked, the hesitation in his voice revealing just how much the dynamic had shifted. Because moments ago, no one would have thought to invite her, and now the question carried genuine interest. Amanda considered it for a brief moment, her eyes scanning the room once more, not with judgment, but with clarity, as if she were measuring more than skill, more than structure, something deeper about the environment itself. And then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "If that is all right," she said, directing the final part toward Brad. And that was where the moment settled, because the decision now rested with him, not as a test of her ability, but as a reflection of his leadership. And for a brief second, the entire room seemed to pause again. Waiting, Brad met her gaze. And this time, there was no dismissal in his expression, no assumption, just a quiet calculation, followed by something that resembled acceptance. "It is," he said finally, his voice steady, though different from before, because it carried the weight of acknowledgement, not dominance. And as the room exhaled, returning slowly to motion, to structure, to routine, the shift that had occurred did not disappear. It settled into the space, becoming part of it, something that would not be spoken openly but would be felt in every interaction that followed. And Amanda stepped forward again, not as an outsider trying to prove herself, but as someone who no longer needed to. And in that quiet transition, the dojo changed in a way that no one would forget. The rhythm of the dojo slowly returned, but it was not the same rhythm as before, because now every movement carried awareness. Every glance held a question that had not existed an hour ago. And as Amanda Carter stepped into line with the others, she did not take a position at the front or the back. She simply chose a place that felt natural, neither claiming status nor avoiding it. And that quiet decision did not go unnoticed, especially by those who had spent years measuring their worth by where they stood. Marcus adjusted his stance beside her, stealing a brief glance as if trying to understand what made her different, not in technique alone, but in presence. While across the mat, Brad Hoffman observed everything with sharpened attention, his earlier confidence replaced by something more deliberate, more careful, as if he were now watching not just to instruct, but to learn something he had not realized he was missing. "Pair up," he called, his voice steady, though less commanding than before, and the students moved quickly, but this time there was hesitation, subtle but visible, as several of them looked toward Amanda, unsure whether to approach her or avoid her, unsure whether she was a beginner or something far beyond that. And in that brief uncertainty, the structure they relied on revealed its fragility. Marcus stepped forward first, his decision breaking the invisible barrier. "I will train with you," he said, his tone respectful, not performative, and Amanda nodded once, accepting without hesitation, without ceremony. As if this moment required nothing more, they took their positions, facing each other, and for a second, Marcus shifted his weight, testing the space, expecting to read her the way he had read every partner before. But there was nothing obvious to read. No tension to exploit, no imbalance to anticipate, just a steady presence that adapted without revealing intention, and that unsettled him in a way he had not experienced before. "Ready," Brad instructed, watching closely now, not as a judge but as an observer. And as the exercise began, something became immediately clear. Amanda did not overpower, she did not rush, she did not assert dominance. Instead, she responded with precision, with timing that felt almost effortless, guiding the movement, rather than forcing it. And within seconds, Marcus found himself adjusting, recalibrating, realizing that what he thought was control was actually being shaped by her awareness. And though nothing dramatic occurred, nothing that could be pointed to as a single defining moment, the outcome was undeniable. Because he stepped back with a quiet exhale, his expression changed not by defeat, but by understanding, and around them the others noticed the subtle shift, the lack of struggle, the absence of tension, and that was when the room grew quiet again, not completely silent this time, but enough that the difference could be felt. Brad stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the interaction, analyzing every detail, not to challenge it, but to comprehend it, because what he was seeing did not align with the way he had been teaching, and that realization carried weight, the kind that does not announce itself but settles deeply. Again, he said, more softly now, and they repeated the movement, and the result was the same, consistent, controlled, efficient, and that consistency removed any doubt that the first moment had been chance, because chance does not repeat itself with such precision. Marcus nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and stepped back. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but sincere, and Amanda returned the nod, her expression unchanged, not proud, not dismissive, just present. And as the class continued, as pairs rotated and exercises shifted, one truth became increasingly clear to everyone in that room. Skill was not what defined her, it was understanding, a depth that could not be measured by rank or title, and for Brad, standing at the center of it all, that truth settled heavier than anything else, because it meant that leadership was no longer about being the strongest voice in the room, but about recognizing when someone else carried something you did not. And in that realization, quiet and undeniable, the foundation of everything he believed began to shift. By the time the final drill cycle began, the energy inside the dojo had transformed into something quieter, sharper, as if every person in that room had been forced to confront a version of themselves they had not expected to see. And Brad Hoffman stood near the center, no longer projecting control, but observing with intention, his arms no longer crossed, his posture more open, as though he was adjusting not just his stance, but his understanding. And Amanda Carter moved through each exercise without drawing attention, yet attention followed her anyway, because consistency at that level could not be ignored. It demanded recognition without asking for it. And as partners rotated again, more students stepped forward willingly now, not out of obligation but curiosity, each one hoping to experience what Marcus had already realized, that what she carried was not something easily explained. And as she worked with them, the pattern remained unchanged: precise timing, calm presence, controlled responses, no wasted movement, no unnecessary force, just clarity in action. And with each repetition, the room grew more still, not in silence, but in focus, because something deeper was being understood, something that went beyond technique, beyond rank, beyond the visible structure they had relied on for so long. Brad stepped closer once more, this time not to interrupt, not to challenge, but to see, really see, the details he had overlooked before, the subtle shifts in weight, the way Amanda anticipated without reacting, the way she allowed others to move fully while guiding the outcome without resistance. And for the first time in years, he felt like a student again, standing in a space he thought he had mastered, only to realize there was more he had never considered. "Everyone pause," he said, his voice steady but quieter now, and the room obeyed. Instantly, though the atmosphere was different, less rigid, more attentive, all eyes turning toward him as he looked at Amanda, not with authority, but with respect that had been earned without a single demand. "Explain that," he said, gesturing lightly, and the request itself carried weight, because it was not a command, it was an acknowledgement. And Amanda paused, considering the room, the people, the shift that had taken place. And then she spoke, her voice calm, clear. "It is not about control," she said, and the simplicity of the statement held the room in place. "It is about awareness, about listening before reacting, about understanding where the movement is going before deciding where to go." And as she spoke, the students leaned in, not physically, but mentally, absorbing something that felt both new and familiar at the same time. "If you try to win the moment, you lose the flow," she continued, her words steady. "But if you understand the flow, the moment resolves itself." And the silence that followed was different from before. It was not confusion, it was recognition, the kind that settles slowly, deeply, and changes how something is seen from that point forward. Brad nodded once, not as a teacher confirming a lesson, but as someone receiving one. And that distinction mattered more than anything else in that moment, because it shifted the dynamic completely, from hierarchy to understanding, from authority to respect. And as the class resumed, as movement returned and voices softened into instruction once again, nothing was quite the same, because now every student carried a piece of what they had just heard. Every motion filtered through a new awareness, and Amanda stepped back into the rhythm without claiming space, without needing recognition, because what she had brought into that room did not require acknowledgement to exist. It simply changed everything around it. And Brad, standing at the edge now, watched in silence, aware that leadership was no longer about standing above, but about knowing when to step aside. And in that quiet realization, deeper than any technique he had ever taught, something within him began to shift permanently. The class moved differently now, not faster, not stronger, but more aware, as if something invisible had been placed into the space between each movement, and no one could ignore it anymore. And Amanda Carter remained within that rhythm without standing out, yet somehow defining it at the same time. Her presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, simply accepted in a way that felt earned rather than granted. And Brad Hoffman watched from the edge of the mat, his role subtly shifting, from center to observer, not because he had lost authority, but because he had recognized something more valuable than holding it tightly. And that realization stayed with him as he stepped forward again. One more round, he said, his voice calm, controlled, but different now, carrying none of the earlier edge, only intention. And the students paired again, but this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only quiet respect in how they approached Amanda, as if they understood that training with her was not about testing themselves against her, but learning from something they could not yet fully grasp. Marcus stepped forward once more, but before he could speak, another student, Daniel, raised his hand slightly. "May I?" he asked, his tone careful, almost formal, and Marcus nodded, stepping back without resistance. The shift in hierarchy subtle but clear, because now the opportunity mattered more than position. Amanda turned toward Daniel, her expression unchanged, steady, receptive, and they took their positions, facing each other in the same space that had felt so different just an hour ago, but now carried a quiet weight of expectation, not for performance, but for understanding. "Begin," Brad said, and as they moved, the difference was immediate, not in speed, not in strength, but in awareness. Daniel approached with caution, not hesitation, but respect for the unknown, and Amanda met him with the same calm precision as before, guiding rather than opposing, responding rather than reacting. And within moments, Daniel paused, not forced, not overwhelmed, but aware that he had reached a point where his own understanding was no longer enough, and that awareness, that recognition, was something new, something deeper than simply completing the drill. He stepped back slightly, exhaling, his expression thoughtful rather than frustrated. "I see it," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Amanda gave a small nod, not confirming, not correcting, just acknowledging that he had reached something on his own. And around them the others watched, not with curiosity now, but with focus, because they were beginning to understand that what she offered was not a technique to copy, but a way of thinking to develop. And that realization changed everything. Brad stepped closer again, his attention fixed not on correcting mistakes, but on observing growth, something he had always aimed for but now saw differently. "What did you notice?" he asked Daniel, his tone open, inviting rather than instructive, and Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "It felt like I was trying to lead, but she already knew where I was going," he said, searching for the right words. Not because she was faster, but because she was already there. And the room grew quiet again, not from shock, but from understanding, because that description resonated with everyone who had trained with her, even if they had not yet put it into words. Amanda remained still, allowing the observation to settle, and Brad nodded slowly, absorbing it himself, because that was the difference he had been trying to identify, not control, not dominance, but presence, a level of awareness that changed the outcome before the moment even unfolded. And as the class continued, as each student carried that idea into their movement, the dojo itself seemed to evolve, not physically, but in purpose, shifting from a place of proving strength to a place of discovering it. And Amanda, standing quietly among them, became less of an outsider and more of a catalyst, someone who had entered without announcement and altered everything without force. And Brad, watching from the center once more, understood that what had happened that day was not a challenge to his authority, but an invitation to grow beyond it. And in that understanding, quiet and steady, the foundation of the dojo changed in a way that would last far beyond that single afternoon. The final minutes of the session carried a different kind of weight, not the tension of proving something, but the quiet gravity of understanding settling into place, and the dojo no longer felt like a space divided by rank, but one connected by a shared awareness that had not existed before. As Amanda Carter stepped back once more, her role complete without ever being declared, and the students moved through their last repetitions with a focus that felt sharper, cleaner, as if each movement now had meaning beyond completion, and Brad Hoffman stood at the center again. But the way he held that position had changed, no longer as someone guarding authority, but as someone guiding it with intention. And as he called the final halt, the room stilled naturally, without force, without command, just collective alignment. "That is enough for today," he said, his voice calm, carrying across the space with quiet clarity, and no one rushed to leave. No one broke formation immediately, because something in the atmosphere asked them to stay just a moment longer, to acknowledge what had taken place. And Brad looked around the room, his gaze moving from one student to another before settling briefly on Amanda, not as an outsider, not as a challenge, but as a presence that had changed the course of the day. "What you experienced today," he continued, "is not about skill alone." And the words landed differently now, because they were not part of a routine speech. They were shaped by what he had witnessed. "It is about how you see, how you listen, how you respond before you act." And the students absorbed it in silence, not because they were being told, but because they had already begun to understand it for themselves. Marcus shifted slightly, his earlier confidence now balanced with humility. Daniel stood still, his expression thoughtful, and even the newer students held a focus that had not been there when the class began. Amanda remained near the edge of the mat, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, as if the transformation around her did not require her to step forward or speak again, and that restraint carried its own weight, because it allowed the lesson to belong to everyone else. Brad took a small step toward her, not closing distance in authority, but in acknowledgement. "You are welcome here," he said, his voice steady, and the simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than any formal recognition could have, because it was not about granting permission, it was about recognizing value. Amanda met his gaze and gave a slight nod, accepting without ceremony, without emphasis, as if it was simply another moment. And yet everyone in that room understood that it was more than that, because it marked the completion of something that had started the moment she walked through the door, and as the class began to break. As students moved to gather their things, there was no rush, no loud conversation, only quiet exchanges, brief nods, subtle glances toward her, each one carrying respect that had not been there before. And even as she moved toward the exit, her steps as unassuming as when she arrived, the space she left behind did not return to what it had been, because something had shifted permanently, something that could not be reversed or forgotten. And Brad remained where he was for a moment longer, watching the door after she passed through it, understanding that leadership was not about being the strongest presence in the room, but about recognizing when strength appears in unexpected forms and allowing it to change you. And as the lights dimmed slightly and the echoes of the day faded into stillness, one truth remained clear in a way that required no explanation. Respect had not been demanded, it had been revealed, and everyone who had witnessed it would carry that understanding long after the doors of the dojo closed behind them. The dojo was quieter than usual the next morning, not empty, but reflective, as if the walls themselves held on to what had happened the day before. And when the doors opened again, the students entered with a different kind of awareness, not just of their movements, but of each other. And Brad Hoffman arrived earlier than he normally did, standing alone at the center of the mat for a moment longer than usual, his gaze steady, his thoughts still carrying the weight of a lesson he had not expected to receive. And when the first students stepped in, they noticed it immediately, not something obvious, but something in the way he stood, less rigid, more present, as if he was no longer trying to control the room, but understand it. Marcus was the first to approach, offering a simple nod that held more respect than any formal greeting ever had, followed by Daniel and the others, each one settling into place with a quiet focus that had not been there before. And when Amanda Carter walked in again, dressed the same, unassuming, steady, there were no smirks this time, no whispers, only acknowledgement, small nods, brief glances that carried recognition, rather than judgment, and she returned them with the same calm presence, neither seeking nor avoiding attention, just existing within the space as she always had. And Brad stepped forward, his voice clear but measured. "We start again," he said, and the simplicity of those words carried something deeper, because it was not just a new class. It was a continuation of something that had begun the day before, something that had shifted the foundation beneath them all. The warm-up began, but it felt different, not mechanical, not rushed, each movement deliberate, each breath intentional. And as the session progressed, the students moved with a level of awareness that reflected what they had learned, not from instruction, but from experience. And when it came time to pair again, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only quiet willingness, and Amanda trained alongside them, not above, not apart, but within, guiding without imposing, demonstrating without declaring, and Brad watched it, all with a clarity he had not possessed before, understanding now that leadership was not about always having the answer, but about creating space for the right answers to emerge. And at one point, he paused the class again, not out of necessity, but intention. "Yesterday," he said, his voice steady, "you saw what happens when assumption meets reality." And the room stilled, not out of obligation, but because they were listening, truly listening. "Do not measure someone by what you see first," he continued, "because what you see is rarely the whole story." And the words settled into the space, not as a lecture, but as a truth they had already witnessed. And he glanced briefly toward Amanda, not to single her out, but to acknowledge what she had brought into that room without ever claiming it. And she remained still, her expression unchanged, because she did not need recognition for what had already been understood. And as the class resumed once more, something became clear to everyone there, something that would stay long after that moment passed, that strength was not loud, it was not obvious, it was not always visible, but when it revealed itself, it did so in a way that could not be ignored. And as the final moments of the